This is lecture 1A for Biology 177, covering anatomical terms and directions. In many different fields of study, there is a common language that is used so that when one person says something, it means the same thing to everyone else that is studying that same subject matter. When we talk about anatomy, we're talking about different body positions. So when we say something is on top of or it's on the side of, we want to make sure that we always understand what that person means. So first, we need to create a standard position. The globally recognized position to create a standard point of reference for anatomy is known as anatomical position. And in standing position, the hands are at the sides with the palms facing forward and the feet together. So the thumbs would be pointing out and toes would be pointing straight ahead. If we take this position and lie the person on their back, we call this supine. If we take that same position and now lie them on their stomach, we call this prone. And you'll see this referenced in different exercises, primarily in physical therapy, throughout a lot of this field. Moving on from anatomical position, we can now talk about regional terms. Now, regional terms are very useful because once we learn one area of the regional term, we can learn a lot of different structures that are underneath it. So, for example, the nose area is called nasal and the armpit region is called axillary. This is going to be very useful later on because the axillary region is going to house the axillary artery, the axillary vein, and the axillary nerve. So once you learn that region, everything else within that region becomes a little bit easier. I'll take you through the anterior or ventral view, and then I'll take you through the posterior view. So first, there's the head region, and this is called cephalic. Cephalic means the head region, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later. From there, working your way down the head, you have the forehead will be frontal. Around the eye is orbital. The nose region is nasal. The cheeks are buccal, and the mouth is oral. Moving down to the neck region is cervical. The upper rib cage region is known as the thoracic region, and this consists of the sternal, which would be your breastbone. And the axillary is actually going to be the armpit region. So directly in your armpit is axillary. Moving down from there, we go to the abdominal region. The abdominal region is going to be everything below your rib cage where there's no bone present. It's going to be the kind of the softer area, or for some of you a little bit more hard if you've been working a lot of abs. Your belly button is known as umbilical. Moving over to the upper limb, we're talking about your arms. The upper limb starts with I'm actually going to take the deltoid, which is going to be the side deltoid muscle. Now, from the deltoid, I want you to move your hand up to the top where you feel a bony protrusion. This bony protrusion is the acromial. The acromial bone is actually going to be part of the shoulder blade and scapula, and a number of ligaments and different muscles attached to this area. Moving down from the acromial, we go again, deltoid. From the deltoid, we go to that upper arm region, which is brachial. That'll be where the bicep is. And then where the bend of the elbow is on the front, we have the antecubital. Moving on from this, we have the forearm, which is the antebrachial, the wrist, carpal, and then the fingers are digital. Additionally, the palm of the hand is referred to as palmar. Let's move down over to the pelvic region. Now, the pelvic region is everything below the abdominal region. So anything below the waist, I always think of where your underwear starts to sit. Moving down from there, you have the inguinal region. Inguinal refers to the groin region, so everything down there. If you are specifically referencing the genitals, either male or female, this is called pubic region. So while it looks like they might be the same region, remember that pubic is simply referencing genitals, whereas inguinal is the region there, sans genitals. Let's move over now to the lower limb. On the side of the hip, we have the coxal region, which references the hips or the hip bones. Moving down from there, we have the femoral region, which is going to represent the thigh. This will be useful later on because what's the bone underneath here? The femur. Moving down from the femoral region, we get to the kneecap area. This is patellar region. And then we get to the shin. Now the shin is divided into two areas. The anterior or frontal region, the frontal region is going to be called the curl region. The curl region represents your shin bone. On the side of the outside of your leg, which we'll learn is called lateral, this is the fibular region. So curl is going to be your shin bone where that hard bone is in front, and fibular is on the side. Your ankle is the tarsal region. And then your toes here would be digital. There's also going to be the dorsal portion of the top of your foot, and then the plantar is going to be the bottom of the foot, as we see. This is going to be the back side of the body with all the regional terms from the back side. Again, starting from the cephalic region, the head, we have the occipital region, which is the back of the skull. Cervical is still on the neck, and we can still see acromial as the upper shoulder. I'm going to work my way down the upper limb now. The acromial still goes down to the brachial, which is that upper arm region. In this case, on the posterior aspect, we're looking at where the tricep would be. And then we have the tip of the elbow, called olecranal. Olecranal, or the olecranon process, is going to be the tip of your elbow. From there, we go to the antebrachial, which is your forearm. And then we have the dorsal portion of your hand, or back of the hand, that ends in the digital or fingers. Let's move now over to the back, or dorsal view. There's the scapular region. This is going to be where your shoulder blades are. We also have the entire vertebral region, which makes up the center of your back, and this is where your vertebral column or the spine would be. From here, we go into the lower part of your back. This is the lumbar. Often you hear that people need lumbar support or things of that nature. This is for the lower back. As we go a little bit lower into where the top of the butt crack is, that's going to be the sacral region. The sacral bone would be just underneath here. Each one of your butt cheeks represents the gluteal region. Gluteal region. From here, we're going to move down to the lower limb. We again have the femoral region, which is going to be that upper thigh. The back of the knee is called the popliteal region, as opposed to the anterior aspect, which would be the patellar region. So back of the knee, popliteal region. Now, moving down to the lower leg, that outside of the leg is still the fibular region. But now the back area where that calf is sural, the sural region. Moving down to the heel bone, we have the calcaneal region. And the bone there is actually called the calcaneus, and that's going to be your heel bone. And finally, we have the plantar surface of the foot, the bottom of the foot. Next, we're going to move into abdominal pelvic quadrants or regions. Now, typically surgeons will use abdominal pelvic quadrants as far as right upper, right lower, left lower, just to kind of divide the area and let you know where they're going. Anatomists and professionals like us will use the more specific regions to reference different areas of the abdominal pelvic area. Now, each one of these is going to be named for a different portion of this area, and the name actually has root words based upon what organs are underneath these areas. When looking at the regions, you can see it's based upon how that position is. We have the right hypochondriac, epigastric, and left hypochondriac regions up top. The right hypochondriac region would be sitting just above where the liver is. The left hypochondriac region is actually going to be where the spleen is, and the epigastric region is actually going to be kind of where the stomach would sit. Now, moving down, we'll go to the center column, right lumbar region, umbilical region, and the left lumbar region. This is going to be actually where the lower back would sit, and then the belly button in the umbilical region, the umbilical region. Finally, moving down, we have the right iliac, the hypogastric, and the left iliac region. It should be fairly obvious why these are called these. The iliac regions, iliac references your hip bones directly. So the right and left hip bones for the right and left iliac region. Hypogastric is actually going to be the lower. Hypo means lower or less than. So hypogastric is the lower portion of your digestive tract where the rectum and then eventually the anus would sit. I've referenced some of these terms already, but these are directional terms that give you reference to where something is in the body in relation to something else oftentimes. Some of them are a little interchangeable. Like for example, our first one is going to be superior. Superior means towards the head end or upper part of a structure or the body above. An example would be the forehead is superior to the nose because the forehead is above the nose. We often use cranial or cephalad as well. Cephalad means towards the head. Same thing with cranial. We typically use superior, but we can use those other terms. Inferior is the opposite of this. Inferior, otherwise known as caudal, and caudal means tail, towards the tail. Inferior, away from the head end or toward the lower part of the structure of the body, below. The navel is inferior to the breastbone. Now we're going to talk about front and back. Anterior or ventral. Ventral typically references position of the spine, so we usually use anterior, but they can be used interchangeably when talking about humans. This means toward or at the front of the body. An example, the breastbone is anterior to the spine. Contrasting with anterior is posterior or dorsal. The easy way to remember this is like dorsal fin. Posterior is like your backside, your butt. This is toward the backside or behind. Example, the heart is posterior to the breastbone. Next, we're going to be referencing towards the center of the body and the outside of the body. Medial is at or towards the midline of the body. The heart is medial to the arm because it's closer to the midline. Lateral is the opposite of this. It is towards the outside of this, towards the outside of the midline. The arms are lateral to the chest. Next, we're going to talk about something that tends to confuse people, but I'll help you simplify it, is proximal and distal. This is typically referencing your limbs, meaning that the shoulder is going to be more proximal than the elbow, and the elbow is more proximal than the wrist. This is always referencing point of origin. So proximal means closer to the point of origin. Distal will mean further away. An example, the elbow is proximal to the wrist. This means that the elbow is closer to the point of origin, which would be the shoulder or the torso, than the wrist is. Remember that contrasting proximal is distal. Distal is further from the point of origin and is going to be represented here by the knee being distal to the thigh. We typically use proximal and distal, like I said, with respect to the limbs. There will be a few parts when we talk later on about some of the different tubes of the body where we have a singular point of origin. And remember that further away from any point of origin is distal, closer to the point of origin is proximal. Next, we're going to talk about superficial and deep. Superficial is relative to the surface of the body. So the skin is superficial to the skeleton. It's more on top of. Deep is going to be the opposite of this, being more internal. The lungs are deep to the rib cage because they are underneath. A few others that I'll talk about, and I do reference on the lecture notes, would be dorsal versus plantar or dorsal versus palmar. Dorsal, again, is going to reference the back of things. Dorsal is the back of the hand as well as the top of the foot. Palmar is the palm of your hand. Plantar is the bottom of your foot. So just when referencing those different things, and you do have to say dorsal surface of the hand or dorsal surface of the foot so that you know that you're referencing either the foot or the hand with respect to those. Body planes. This is something that a lot of personal trainers or physical therapists cover because it lets you know how we actually move. But in anatomy, we also use it as different sorts of views to tell you how we're kind of dissecting the body. There are three major planes. Transverse, or the horizontal plane, that can be seen labeled C, cuts into the superior and the cephalic and caudal regions. So we can see this on C, we're cutting the top and the half of the body in two. Exercises for this would actually be rotational base. Different things like sideways med ball throws, Russian twists, or any sort of chop or lift exercise that's going to be rotational in nature. That's going to tax the transverse plane. Next is sagittal here on A. Sagittal cuts along the longitudinal axis of the body, separating it from left and right. This can be further divided into mid-sagittal or parasagittal. Now, mid-sagittal means that it is exactly through the midline, like a perfect equal cut. There's only one mid-sagittal section on any given structure where there's an equal divide between right and left. Otherwise, it's called just sagittal usually. But the full reference is parasagittal, where it's off of the midline but separating right from left, although it is disproportionate. Sagittal plane exercises are going to be anything that kind of occur here, and a lot of exercises actually are sagittal, to where you're talking about squats, deadlifts, and things of this nature. Frontal or coronal is going to be the final one. This is on B. Here we can see we're separating the front from the back. Now, things like this would actually be moving in the frontal plane, would be like lateral lunges or any sort of lateral steps to the side. And this is actually going to be, like I said, separating the front from the back, anterior and posterior sections. And we typically use a lot of frontal views throughout anatomy and physiology to get a good view of all the major organs. Finally, we will cover body cavities. Now, the vertebral body, such as humans, is divided into two principal body cavities, each which can be subdivided further. We have the dorsal body cavity, which houses the cranial cavity and spinal cavity. This is going to, of course, house the brain and spinal cord. And then we have the ventral body cavity, as can be seen in these three separate red cavities. The top one is going to be the thoracic cavity, which would house the heart, lungs, as well as other cardiovascular-based organs. It is separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal or abdominopelvic cavity via the diaphragm. The abdominal cavity is going to house probably the most organs of all of the cavities, and this is going to, of course, house the stomach, the intestines, both large and small, the pancreas, spleen, a number of blood vessels, and it's going to then lead down to the pelvic cavity. The pelvic cavity is going to typically house the reproductive organs, as well as some finishing portions of the digestive tract before it exits out. Additionally, in the posterior aspect of the abdominal cavity and in portions of the pelvic cavity will also be parts of the urinary system. So the kidneys sit in the abdominal cavity, and then the urinary bladder will sit in the pelvic cavity. So that's going to make up Lecture 1A and all the different directional terms covered. There will be a quiz for this later.